The Big Mistake and Other Stories by Bruna Deriu.
The Big Mistake. Ian James was really happy. The school year had finished, and the results of his exams were better than expected. Now, after all those weeks of hard work, he was going on holiday. Fortunately, his rich uncle, Uncle Patrick, hadn't forgotten his promise. Ian had spoken to him on the phone 2 nights before. Everything was planned. Uncle Patrick had left for France, so his house by the sea was empty. He'd left the fridge full of food and drink, and the key was under the doormat. Ian could use the house until his uncle returned. Paula, his girlfriend, was coming to stay with him the next day, and they would be able to spend some time together. He stared through the train window, watching the houses, fields, and people go by. The train began to slow down as it came into Bridgeview station. The fat woman that sat opposite him was still asleep. The train stopped suddenly.
Ooh!
She exclaimed, standing up and putting her head out of the window.
It's Bridgeview!
She picked up her handbag and rushed to the door.
It's lucky I woke up. Otherwise I would have gone on to Little Point.
So Ian knew he had to get off the train at the next station. He looked at his watch as the train left the station. Almost 6 o'clock. He was hungry and started thinking about all the food in the fridge that was waiting for him. The scenery changed. In the distance he could see the sea and a few people on the beach. Ian had never been to his uncle's house before. He hadn't realized that he lived so close to the sea. He hoped it wasn't too polluted. He could smell the salty air of the sea. The train hooted as it approached the station of Little Point. Ian grabbed his suitcase and got off the train. Luckily, there was a taxi free. He put his case in the boot and asked the driver to take him to Cliff View.
"What number?"
The driver asked.
28.
Ian replied. It didn't take long to get there. The taxi stopped outside the largest house in the street. Ian paid the taxi driver and picked up his case. As he walked up the path, he wondered who had planted all the flowers in the garden. He didn't think his uncle was the type to be interested in gardening. He continued up the path and stopped at the door. He lifted up the doormat. The key was exactly where his Uncle Patrick had promised. He opened the door and entered the hall, closing the door behind him. He left his suitcase by the stairs, walked through the hallway, and into the lounge. There were 2 long sofas in one corner of the room, and a table and chairs occupied the center. The floor was covered by a thick brown carpet, and beige curtains hung at the windows. There was an enormous cabinet containing a lot of different ornaments and a vase of flowers on the table. Ian explored the rest of the ground floor. There was a bathroom, a dining room, a small study, and a large kitchen. Ian carried his suitcase upstairs. There were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. He chose the biggest room and threw his case on the bed. He was too tired to unpack it. He went into the bathroom and had a quick shower. He left the towels on the floor and went to get dressed. He emptied his case, throwing his clothes on the chair. He would hang them up in the wardrobe later. Now he was hungry, so he went downstairs to get some food. He opened the fridge. What a disappointment! There were 2 boiled potatoes, some ham, and a bottle of milk. It wasn't much, but Ian had no choice. He ate his meal in the lounge in front of the television. When he had finished, he took the dishes into the kitchen and threw them into the sink. He heard the plate break. When he returned to the lounge, his favourite quiz show was starting. He lay down on the sofa to watch television. After a while, his eyes felt heavy. He was tired. He turned off the television and went upstairs to bed. He had been asleep for about an hour when he was awoken by a loud noise. A window being smashed. He heard the glass fall to the floor. He sat up in bed and switched on the bedside lamp. He could hear voices from downstairs. Burglars! He sat still for a moment, wondering what to do. The telephone was downstairs, so he couldn't call for help. Should he go downstairs and face them? No, they may be dangerous. He heard them walking through the hallway and turning on a light switch. Ian got out of bed and crept onto the landing. He could hear the thieves talking. He listened to what they were saying.
Where did you bury him?
I think it's better if you don't know. Don't worry, nobody will ever find him.
Oh, God, I didn't mean to do it.
Ian trembled. The thieves had killed someone and buried the body. He looked down the stairs and saw the two men. One of them was sitting on the sofa. The other stood leaning against the table. Both were wearing black suits. The man near the table had a red stain on his white shirt. Blood? Ian walked as quietly as possible into the bedroom. He closed the door behind him. How could he escape? He thought of a film that he had once seen. A man had escaped from a burning house by using the bed sheets as a rope. Ian ran to the window. He looked down. It was a long drop. There was no grass beneath him, just concrete. Suddenly the voices were nearer. They were coming up the stairs. Ian shook with fear. He didn't know where to hide. He looked around the room desperately. The wardrobe! He ran to it, climbed inside, and pulled the door shut. The voices and footsteps approached. Someone opened the bedroom door. Ian stopped breathing. One of the men spoke. "I told you, there's nobody here. Look for yourself." They closed the door and continued along the landing. Ian jumped out of the wardrobe and ran to the door. He opened it slowly. He checked that the landing was empty. The voices were coming from one of the larger bedrooms. They were looking for money. Ian ran quickly out of the room and down the stairs. He had to call the police. He picked up the telephone and dialed 999. The phone was dead. The murderers had cut the outside wires. How could he call for help? He looked down at his bare feet. His slippers were upstairs. So were his clothes. He couldn't go out into the cold night in his pajamas. The light on the landing suddenly came on. He could hear someone coming down the stairs. Ian threw himself onto the floor behind the table. One of the men had gone into the kitchen. He heard him opening a cupboard and pouring out a glass of water. He had an idea. Now that the men had separated, maybe he could face them on his own. He moved as quietly as possible and hid behind the kitchen door. The man finished his drink and walked towards the hall. Ian was ready. Just as the man put his foot in the doorway, Ian pushed the door as hard as he could. The man shouted with pain and fell onto the floor. Ian quickly closed the door and turned the key. He knew that the man's cries would soon be heard by his accomplice, so he had to try and stop the other one. He didn't have time to think. The man was coming down the stairs. Ian crouched down behind a cupboard. It was dark, and he couldn't be seen. The man lost his balance and fell down the last few steps. Ian unplugged the telephone and ran quickly to where the man lay. He was face down and not fully conscious. Using the telephone wire, Ian tied the man's hands behind his back. "Who are you? What do you want?" the man cried. Ian didn't answer, and ran up the stairs to his bedroom. He found his slippers and his dressing gown. Now he had to run and get help. He jumped over the man at the bottom of the stairs, ignoring his cries, and ran towards the front door. He threw it open and screamed with fright. There, before him, was the man that he'd locked in the kitchen. Blood was dripping from his nose. The man took hold of Ian's arms and put them behind his back. He was very strong. Ian couldn't escape.
You little hooligan! You forgot about the back door in the kitchen, didn't you?
He pushed Ian onto the sofa. "Bill, untie me!" The man that Ian had left at the bottom of the stairs stood up and walked towards them. The telephone hung from the wire behind his back. "Who's this?" he asked.
I don't know, but I'm going to teach him a lesson.
He put his hand to the inside pocket of his jacket. He was looking for his gun.
Damn, I must have left it in the car,
the man said. He went out of the front door. Ian shook with fear. He looked around him. He had no chance of escaping. The men were too big and too strong. Maybe he could convince them to let him go.
Listen,
he said.
I've got some money upstairs in my case. You can have it if you let me go. I won't tell anyone.
What? The man laughed. You're joking. The other man came back in. He was holding a small black object. Ian closed his eyes. It was the end.
No, no,
he begged.
Sorry, you deserve it,
came the reply. Ian waited, his eyes still closed tightly.
Hello, police? I've just found a thief in my house. Yes, he's here in front of me.
Ian opened his eyes in amazement. The little black object was a telephone.
Your house?
He cried. They didn't answer him.
The address? 28 Cliff View. Yes, he's under control. We'll wait. What do you mean, your house? This is my uncle's house.
Try telling that to the police. Ian tried to convince them that he was telling the truth. They wouldn't listen. A few minutes later, a police car arrived. Ian was arrested. At the police station, he was questioned, but nobody would believe him. He was allowed to phone his uncle.
Talk to them, Uncle Patrick. Tell them that the house is yours.
His uncle's reply shocked him. I can't, Uncle Patrick replied. It isn't my house. Mine is number 26. Uncle Patrick spoke to the police and explained the situation. Ian had made a terrible mistake.
What about the man they buried? I heard them talking about the murder,
he said to the policeman. The two men looked at each other. What man? The policeman asked. That wasn't a man. It was a dog. We hit it with a car coming back from the restaurant. It didn't have a collar. It was a stray. What else could I do?
And the blood on your shirt?
That's not blood, the policeman replied. It's wine. I can smell it from here. Ian felt stupid. He had to stay in the station while the police and one of the men went to check that nothing had been stolen. When they returned, they had Ian's suitcase with them. It was almost 8 o'clock in the morning. Ian was not charged and was free to go. He apologized to the two men and was accompanied to his uncle's house. This time the right one. Ian was left in the doorway of 26 Cliffview. He'd had a bad night and he was tired. He found the door key under the mat. There was a letter under the door. He bent to pick it up. It was from Paula. It read,
After 3 hours on the train, I expected to find you at home. Don't bother phoning. I don't want to speak to you.
Ian had some explaining to do.
Marge and Olive. Marge and Olive were two sisters who had lived together all their lives. They were both over 70. When their father died, leaving them the house and some money, it was Olive who was the boss. She was a little older than Marge and had a very bad temper. Marge was afraid of her and soon learnt to do everything she was told to do. Olive did the shopping, paid the electricity, gas and water bills, and decided how to spend their money. Marge did the cleaning, the cooking, and decided when to put the rubbish out to be collected. Marge hadn't been shopping for a long time. She couldn't walk far because of her arthritis. Besides, it wasn't necessary for her to go shopping. Olive was happy to go on her own. Marge hated shopping days. Olive arrived home carrying the heavy bags, always in a terrible mood, and ordered Marge to make her a cup of tea. Then Marge would go and get Olive's slippers. Olive would then start complaining and say that Marge was lucky to have someone to do the shopping for her. Marge nodded silently. She knew it was better not to argue with Olive. As Marge unpacked the shopping, putting everything in the cupboards, Olive talked about the price of things, especially clothes. They were so expensive. That is why they had to share them. Or, more exactly, Marge would have Olive's old clothes. Marge often asked her sister to buy her certain foods she liked. Olive would always refuse because she couldn't eat these things herself. Cheese, milk and yogurt would give her terrible stomach pains. So Marge was left without. Marge had a really difficult time when Olive was ill. She would often have to get out of bed late at night to give Olive a tablet for her angina. Sometimes Olive would wake her up just because she wanted a cup of tea. Marge would always obey. She didn't have the courage to refuse, and by now she was used to being treated badly. Besides, she had a secret that helped her to put up with Olive. Alfred was back. When Marge was much younger, Alfred had been her boyfriend, and they had planned to get married. Olive was really jealous and had done everything possible to separate the two. When she discovered that Alfred had been accused of being a deserter during the Second World War, she had told her father. Alfred had tried to explain that it had all been a mistake, but their father would not listen. He sent Alfred away and ordered Marge not to see him again. Alfred left the town, and later Marge heard that he had married someone else. It took her a long time to forget him. She hated Olive for this and would never forgive her. Now, after all these years, Alfred had moved back into town. He had lost his wife a few years before and had written to Marge asking her to forgive him. He was aware of the terrible life that Marge had with her domineering sister, and he felt responsible. In his first letter, he told Marge how he wished that he had had the courage to explain to her father instead of leaving her. He had been a coward. Marge was so pleased to receive his letter that she forgave him instantly. She wrote back, and they began to write regularly. When Olive found out that Alfred had returned, she tried to stop Marge writing to him. Marge ignored her, and even managed to meet Alfred on the days when Olive went shopping. They discovered that, despite their age and the years that had passed, there was still something special between them. Marge knew that if Olive discovered their meetings, she would never see Alfred again. The thought of this was terrible. Since Alfred had returned, she had begun to live again. They talked about lost friends, the dance halls that they had danced in, and the wonderful music of the old days. Sometimes they would sing together. Alfred would often bring her chocolates, sweets, and even the cream and yogurt she adored. For the first time after so many years, Marge felt wanted. It was the only thing that helped her through the day, and she wasn't prepared to lose Alfred again. Even though they met occasionally, they decided that it was better to keep writing to each other. Olive would be suspicious if Marge stopped receiving letters. She'd miss them too. Olive would always read Marge's letters. She would say she had a headache and that she would go upstairs to lie down. But Marge knew it was just an excuse. She had tried hiding them, but it was no use. Olive still found them. At their last meeting, Alfred had asked her to marry him. She had accepted, but what about Olive? Marge had thought about leaving home, but this meant that she'd lose all her money. Olive kept the bank books in her name. No, it was Olive that would have to go. The next evening, Marge and Alfred met at the same time, at the same place. They talked about Olive, and Alfred told Marge about a plan that would finally solve everything. Marge listened carefully. Alfred was a genius. She was sure that the plan would work, and soon they would be free. Alfred gave her a small tin and a letter. He told her to be very careful and to make sure that Olive did not find them. Marge hid them in her handbag. She could not wait, so they decided to carry out the plan the very next day. Marge slept well that night. When Olive came downstairs for breakfast, she sang cheerfully to herself. Olive told her to shut up immediately and complained that her tea was cold. "The postman has already been," Marge said as she fried the eggs. "So what?" Olive answered. "There was just one letter for me," Marge replied. Olive smiled. Good, she thought. Something for her to read later on. Marge put the fried egg on Olive's plate. "What shall we have for lunch today?" Marge asked. "This egg is overcooked. Give me the other one," Olive ordered. Marge obeyed and said once again, What shall we— I heard you the first time. I'm not deaf. Marge jumped. She always did when Olive shouted. Meatloaf, Olive continued. We always have meatloaf on Tuesday, and don't ask stupid questions. Marge nodded. They carried on eating their breakfast in silence. Afterwards, Olive went into the garden to read the newspaper. Marge did her housework, then began to prepare the meatloaf. When she'd mixed the ingredients together, she went to her handbag and found the small tin. She opened it and added the contents to the mixture. She mixed it in quickly and hid the empty tin in the washing machine. Then she put the meatloaf in the oven to cook and tried not to act suspiciously. When the meatloaf was cooked, Marge sniffed at it. She could not smell anything unusual. She was not hungry, though. She told Olive that she had a headache and that she did not want to eat. Olive was not particularly worried and started eating. Marge watched her from behind the kitchen door. That day, Olive ate more than usual. After lunch, Marge did the washing up and Olive went to her room to lie down. Marge knew that she would read the letter. Things were going exactly as planned. Olive rushed into Marge's room, found the letter, then returned to her own room to read it.
Dear Marge, the small tin that you found at the bottom of your garden is a very strong poison that I bought for the mice in my cellar. You were right, my dear. It's the only way to get rid of Olive. Put it in the meatloaf that you mentioned. She won't notice the taste or smell. The effect is almost immediate. Please be patient. All my love, Alfred.
Olive read the letter quickly. Then she read it again, stopping at the word poison. She threw the letter down and suddenly felt hot. An unbearable pain began in her stomach, and she cried out, "Oh my God! I've been poisoned! Help!" Marge heard her from downstairs. She turned the volume of the radio up and ignored her. The pain got worse, and Olive fell to the floor, trying to breathe. How long would it take? Was she dying? Yes, the letter had said that the poison was very strong. She lay on the carpet, waiting for someone to help her. She felt another pain, much stronger than the other, in her chest. Her left arm ached. It was her heart. She was having an attack. Where were her tablets? She called for Marge. Marge sang to herself and waited. After a while, she could no longer hear Olive calling for her. She picked up the telephone and called for an ambulance. When it arrived, Olive was dead. Marge cried as they took her away, but she cried tears of joy. The doctor signed the death certificate. Olive had died of a heart attack. There was no mention of poison. Alfred and Marge were married a few months after Olive's death. They often talked about how they got rid of Olive, especially after their bedtime drink. The small tin of poison was given a place on the kitchen shelf, where its label could be seen by all. It read, "Concentrated powdered milk."
Simpsons' buried treasure. Nicholas walked slowly down the narrow country road, holding the dirty piece of paper tightly in his hand. In the distance he could see Buster standing against the wall, smoking a cigarette. Nicholas was frightened. He knew he was in Buster's territory, and that Buster would probably hit him for being there. As usual, Buster was not alone. Lewis and Driscoll, two of his closest friends, stood waiting for orders. Nicholas knew he was in trouble. Buster always wanted to show that he was the boss.
Look, there's Rabbit.
Nicholas stopped suddenly as the three boys ran towards him. Buster threw down his cigarette. He blew the last of the smoke into Nicholas's face.
Are you deaf or just stupid, eh, Rabbit?
Nicholas coughed as the disgusting smoke filled his nostrils. He felt a sudden blow to the side of his face. His cheek hurt, and he wanted to cry, but he made himself stop.
You're trespassing, Rabbit,
Driscoll continued.
I've told you to keep away from here.
The boys surrounded him, and a heavy hand pushed him to the ground. Nicholas covered his head with his arms and closed his eyes, waiting for the blows.
What's this? Looks like a map. That's old Simpsons' garden. Yeah, but what are all those crosses for?
Nicholas opened his eyes and lifted his head. Buster was holding the piece of paper he had dropped.
Hey, Rabbit, whose map is this? What's it for?
Buster grabbed Nicholas by the arm and pulled him up. Nicholas kept his head down and didn't answer.
Come on, tell me before I...
Buster pushed Nicholas against the wall.
Okay. It's a map of Simpsons' garden,
he answered reluctantly.
I can see that, you idiot. What are you doing with it?
Once again, Nicholas refused to speak. The three bullies stood over him, and he knew that they were waiting for an answer.
It's a map of Simpsons' buried treasure, but it's only a legend. Nobody believes that it really exists,
he said.
Ah, no. Then where were you going?
Lewis replied.
Yeah, that's why you had the nerve to pass through here. You're hoping to find the treasure yourself. I've heard about that treasure,
added Driscoll.
They say that old Simpson buried a fortune in his garden before he died. Oh, no. It's only a legend. Nobody really believes that story.
Another blow made Nicholas fall to the ground. His arm ached.
Shut up. I'll be the judge of that,
Buster said, smiling to the others.
Now, get lost.
Nicholas stood up and moved away.
Go on! Run!
Lewis yelled, laughing. Nicholas ran as fast as he could. Laughter and cries of,
"Run, Rabbit, run!"
came from behind him. Once he'd turned the corner, he stopped to catch his breath and waited. As expected, the three boys were walking towards old Simpson's house, chatting together excitedly. They didn't know that Nicholas was following them. When the small group entered the garden, Nicholas crept into a large hole in the hedge of the house next door. Here he could watch the boys without the risk of being discovered.
"Oh, no,"
Buster exclaimed, his face falling. The garden was really overgrown with grass and weeds everywhere.
"How can we dig for treasure if we can't see where we're digging?"
Lewis asked, kicking at some weeds.
"We'll have to cut the grass first,"
Buster announced.
"You two go and get some gardening tools and a lawnmower. Don't forget the spades."
Lewis and Driscoll disappeared and left Buster alone in the garden. Nicholas knelt down to rest his tired legs and prepared himself for a long wait. The wind blew through the hedge, and a large grey cloud blocked out the last rays of the sun. He looked up and realized that it was going to rain.
"Come on!"
Buster exclaimed as the two boys struggled through the wooden gate with their equipment.
I'll start mowing. You two can clear up the grass,
he ordered, pushing the heavy mower onto the untidy lawn. Nicholas watched patiently as the bullies worked. The rhythmic sound of the lawn-mower and the sweet smell of freshly cut grass was quite pleasant. The first drops of rain made them work faster, and they hardly spoke as they carried on working.
"Leave the grass over there in the corner,"
Buster shouted over the noise of the howling wind.
"Hurry up! There's going to be a storm."
He had hardly finished the sentence when a loud noise startled all four of them. Thunder! Large drops of rain fell heavily, soaking them to the skin instantly. All except Nicholas. The thick hedge provided an excellent shelter, and he enjoyed watching the three boys struggling with their spades and following the instructions on the map.
"Have you found anything?"
Louis shouted, wiping his face with a damp sleeve.
"No. What about you, Driscoll?"
Buster replied.
"Nothing, and I've dug 3 holes already. I'm really wet." "Me too."
The wet earth became heavier by the minute, and Buster was getting tired.
"This stupid spade won't come out of the mud!"
he cried. He was getting angrier and angrier. To the relief of his friends, he shouted,
"Let's get out of here! It's obvious that the treasure doesn't exist."
As he turned to go, he stumbled over one of the holes that he dug.
Ah!
Nicholas covered his mouth with his hand. The sight of Buster lying on the ground with his face covered with mud was more than he'd expected. He started laughing uncontrollably. He knew that he couldn't be heard above the noise of the rain. He watched as the boys, arguing amongst themselves, collected up their tools and left the garden. Nicholas couldn't stop laughing. As suddenly as it had started, the rain stopped. Nicholas crawled out of his hiding place. He looked round the garden. It was wet, but very tidy. In his haste, Buster had forgotten his spade, and had left it sticking out of the ground. Nicholas jumped over the hedge to get it, then ran to the front of the house and waited. Finally, the grey clouds disappeared, and the sun came out. A blue car, which Nicholas recognized immediately, approached slowly, stopping outside old Simpson's house. The driver, a tall, smart woman with red hair, stepped out of the car and walked towards him.
"Nicholas!"
she called, looking at the muddy spade and smiling.
"Don't tell me that you've already done that job we talked about. You haven't tidied up the garden already, have you?"
"Yes, Miss Simpson."
Nicholas replied, wiping his forehead and sighing. The woman walked around to the back of the garden.
"Good Lord! What a wonderful job you've done! And in the rain, too! You poor thing!"
she continued, putting a hand on his shoulder.
"And you've even dug the holes for my rose bushes, exactly where I wanted them!"
she exclaimed. Without hesitation, she put her hand into her shoulder bag and pulled out a small purse.
"Let me pay you at once. I didn't expect you to do such a good job. And all on your own, too."
She took out 1, 2, then 3 5-pound notes from her purse. Nicholas gasped.
"But, Miss Simpson..."
He pretended to be surprised.
"Oh, no, I insist. Take it. You've done a very good job."
Thanking her again and again, Nicholas accepted the money and turned to go home. He knew that he would have to avoid Buster for a while. Fortunately for him, a bad cold would keep Buster out of the way for a long time.
A strange case. As a police detective, I've seen and heard many strange and unusual things. I suppose that after 40 years of service, this is only to be expected. However, I thought nothing could surprise me. That was until I met Mr. Perch. Poor old Perch. A tall, elegant man. I'll never forget him. When he came to the police station one morning and told me his incredible story, I confess I thought he was senile. He told me that he was going to be murdered later that night. I thought he had invented the story just to get some attention, and this made me feel sorry for him. There was something about him that reminded me of my Uncle Henry. They had the same walk and the same way of speaking, clear and precise. I couldn't send him away. It was almost lunchtime, so I asked him to stay for a while and chat. He was an intelligent man. We talked about all sorts of things. Politics, the Second World War, even the weather. I remember wondering why a man like him had become obsessed with this idea of murder. When he told me that he was a widower, I understood. He also had no children and no relatives. He was completely alone. I offered him a cup of coffee, but he refused. He said that he had to go, but first he made me promise not to look for his murderer. He added that his wife had appeared to him in a dream and had told him what was going to happen to him. I asked him if he wanted protection and promised to send him someone later that evening. When he refused, I lost my patience. I had enough cases to solve without worrying about crimes that had not yet been committed. Perch stood up and turned to leave. He said that he did not want protection. He was looking forward to seeing his wife again. He was so convincing that I almost believed him. Through the glass door, I could see Marshall coming towards my office. He was holding the report that I was waiting for. I signalled for him to wait outside, then I accompanied Perch to the door. He kept repeating that after his death, he did not want us to look for the murderer. It was a waste of time, he said. The criminal would get the punishment that he deserved. As I opened the door, I asked him why. Why should someone want to murder him? Did he have any enemies? When he pulled out a thick wad of banknotes from his pocket, I was shocked. I told him that he was looking for trouble and advised him to go to the bank and deposit the money before he went home. He just laughed. The last thing he said before leaving was,
"Man cannot change his destiny."
I watched him leave and wondered if I would ever see him again. When Marshall came into my office, I told him about Perch's visit. Marshall was new and did not have much experience. I thought he would laugh at Perch's story, but he didn't. He seemed quite worried. He asked me for the old man's address and offered to go and see if he needed anything. I was surprised and pleased at his offer, but I didn't really think it was necessary for him to go and see Perch. Work kept me busy for most of the day, and I forgot about Perch's visit. When I received the phone call in the early hours of the morning, I knew that Perch was involved. A boy walking his dog had found a body. I rushed to the scene of the crime and discovered that it was old Perch. He'd been hit on the back of the head with a heavy object just a few meters away from his home. I'll never forget the expression on his face. His lips smiled, and he looked happy. I like to think that he had met his wife after all. The money that he'd shown me had been stolen. The thief had also taken his wedding ring. A voice in my head kept saying,
"You see, I told you so."
Even though I had promised Perch not to look for the murderer, I had to do my job. Besides, I wanted to find the criminal and make him pay for what he had done. I spent all morning looking through the computer files for possible suspects, and I found plenty. It was such an easy job, robbing an old man. It could have been anyone. Marshall wanted to go and pay them a visit that very day, but I was tired. I had a headache, and I couldn't stop thinking of Perch and the tragic way he had died. I considered myself responsible. If only I had accompanied him home. If only I had convinced him to take the money to the bank. If only... Marshall and I questioned a few of our suspects. They all seemed to have an alibi, so nobody was arrested. Marshall was especially interested in finding the criminal. The death of the old man seemed to trouble him in some way. Days passed, and we were getting nowhere. I had taken this particular case to heart, and one day I even dreamt of old Perch. He was sitting on a park bench, next to a pleasant-looking woman. I presumed that this was his wife. He lifted a hand and pointed at me.
"Remember your promise,"
he said.
"The thief will be punished. Have patience."
As in all dreams, I woke up before I had a chance to answer him. The next morning, I had an appointment with Marshall at the office. As I sat waiting, I heard a voice in my ear.
"Detective Galloway, don't forget your promise."
It was Perch's voice. I turned around expecting to find someone behind me, but there was nobody there. I was under pressure, and I needed to solve this case in a hurry. 3 days had passed since Perch's death. I had plenty of work to keep me occupied, but I could not stop thinking about old Perch. It was 10:30 when Marshall arrived, bringing me my mid-morning coffee and sandwiches. I wasn't hungry, so I told him to take a break himself. We talked about Perch. There was something that I hadn't told Marshall. Perch had showed me a note he had written for me and had wrapped it around the wad of money. In this, he explained how the thief would be punished. I was about to tell him about this when he said something that puzzled me. He said that he didn't think the thief would get the punishment that Perch had predicted. It was unlikely for someone to choke on a piece of bread. Exactly what Perch had written in his note. How did Marshall know about this? Unless he was the murderer. He sat in front of me, calmly eating the sandwiches. I stood up and demanded to know who had given him this information. When had he seen the note? His face grew white, and he realized that he had made a mistake. He tried to find an excuse. Then he suddenly started to cough. I waited for him to stop, but he didn't. He just carried on, coughing and gasping for breath. I didn't know what to do. I tried hitting him hard on the back, but it was no use. I rushed to the office door and called for Patterson and Taylor. By the time they reached the office, Marshall lay on the floor. He was already blue in the face. Patterson pulled him to his feet, and I watched helplessly as they tried to force the piece of bread out of his throat. Yes, the piece of bread that Perch had warned me about. Unfortunately for Marshall, there was nothing that could be done to save him. Patterson lowered him to the ground, and we called the coroner. I suddenly felt ill. After Marshall's death, I made a few inquiries. Marshall had been a gambler. He had lost a lot of money in a poker game and had got into bad company. He had a long list of debts to pay, and some of his creditors were dangerous people. When he had seen the wad of notes that Perch carried about with him, he could not resist the opportunity of getting himself out of trouble. His uniform did not mean much to him. He was only interested in himself. This explained his concern and the reason why he was so interested in the case. The case had been solved without any help from me or my colleagues. Perch had been right, and now he could rest in peace.